Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment purposes.
The entire studio went silent for a moment, because no one expected this celebrity interview to turn this tense. What happens when one of Hollywood's most charismatic stars sits down on live television, expecting a normal conversation, only for the interview to slowly turn into one of the most emotional and uncomfortable moments the studio has ever witnessed? That's exactly what unfolded the morning Will Smith walked onto the stage of The View. The lights inside the studio were bright that morning, the kind of brightness that makes every reaction impossible to hide. The audience buzzed with excitement as producers signaled the show was seconds away from going live. Cameras slid quietly across the stage, capturing the familiar panel of hosts sitting behind their table. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center, calm but observant, flipping through her cue cards. To her right, Joy Behar leaned slightly forward, already wearing the curious smile she often had when a celebrity guest was about to walk out. Sunny Hostin adjusted her notes. Alyssa Farah Griffin glanced toward the stage entrance. And Sarah Haynes whispered something that made the others laugh softly. Everything felt normal. Routine. Predictable. Then the announcer's voice echoed across the studio. Please welcome Academy Award-winning actor Will Smith. The audience erupted instantly. Applause filled the room as Will Smith stepped onto the stage, smiling politely as he waved. He looked composed, dressed sharply, the kind of presence that had made him one of Hollywood's most beloved stars for decades. But if you looked closely, something about his expression seemed different. Not angry, not nervous, just heavier. Whoopi stood to greet him first. Well, look who's here, she said warmly as they shook hands. Will smiled. Good to see you, Whoopi. He took his seat across from the panel as the applause slowly faded. For a moment, everything unfolded exactly the way viewers expected. Light conversation. Friendly smiles. Sarah started things off. Will, it's great to have you here. It's been a while since we've seen you on daytime TV. Will nodded politely. Yeah, it has. But it's good to be back. Sunny leaned forward. You've had an incredible career, movies, music, producing. But lately you've also been talking a lot about personal growth. Will's smile flickered slightly. Yeah, life has a way of teaching you lessons whether you're ready or not. A few audience members chuckled softly. But Whoopi watched him carefully. She'd interviewed thousands of celebrities over the years, and she knew the difference between someone who was simply promoting a project and someone carrying something deeper. Joy jumped in next. So let's talk about this new chapter for you, she said casually. You've spoken about reflection, about mistakes, about accountability. Will nodded again. But this time, the smile didn't return. Yeah, he said quietly. And when you're in the public eye, Joy continued, those lessons don't just happen privately. They happen in front of, well, the entire world. The audience murmured slightly. The tone had shifted. Just a little. Will folded his hands together. You're not wrong about that. Sarah quickly tried to lighten things. But you've always had this incredible ability to bounce back, right? Will paused. The pause lasted just a second longer than expected. Then 2. Then 3. And suddenly the room felt different. Because instead of giving the usual confident answer people expected from him, Will looked down for a moment. When he looked back up, the confidence was gone. You know, he said slowly, people always talk about bouncing back like it's easy. The hosts went quiet. So many people think strength means smiling through everything, pretending you're fine, pretending the pressure doesn't get to you. The audience leaned in. And the truth is, Will continued, his voice softer now, sometimes you're not fine. No one interrupted him. Not even Joy. Whoopi rested her hands on the table, watching him carefully. Sometimes, Will said, you're carrying things people can't see. Sunny spoke gently. Are you saying the pressure became overwhelming? Will gave a small, thoughtful nod. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Joy tilted her head slightly. But some people would say that pressure comes with fame, she said. That when you choose to live in the spotlight, you accept that scrutiny. There was no hostility in her tone. But there was honesty. And honesty on live television can sometimes be dangerous. Will exhaled slowly. You're right, he admitted. But what people forget is, celebrities are still human. A few audience members clapped quietly. But Joy didn't move on. Instead, she leaned forward. Human, yes, she said carefully. But also accountable. The room went completely silent. The word hung in the air. Accountable. Everyone knew what she was referring to, even though no one had said it out loud yet. For the first time since the interview began, Will's jaw tightened slightly. Whoopi sensed the tension instantly. "All right," she said calmly, trying to ease the moment. "Let's not turn this into an interrogation." But Joy wasn't finished. "I'm not interrogating," she said. "I'm asking what viewers are thinking." The audience shifted in their seats. And suddenly, the friendly interview had transformed into something else entirely. Because now every camera in the studio was locked on Will Smith. And everyone watching could feel it. The conversation was heading some way unavoidable. Will looked from Joy, to Sunny, to Sarah, and finally to Whoopi. His voice was calm when he spoke. But there was emotion behind it. "You want to talk about accountability?" Joy nodded. "Yes." Will leaned forward slightly. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's talk about it." And in that moment, the entire energy of the room changed. Because no one on that stage expected what Will Smith was about to say next. The studio stayed quiet after Will said those words. For a moment, no one moved. No one interrupted. Even the audience seemed to sense that the conversation had crossed a line where things could no longer go back to being light or comfortable. Will leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling as if he had been holding something in for a long time. Joy Behar watched him carefully. She had asked the question, but now even she seemed unsure how far this moment might go. Sunny Hostin folded her hands together on the table. Sarah Haynes glanced briefly toward Whoopi Goldberg, silently asking if the show should steer the conversation some way safer. But Whoopi didn't stop it. She simply looked at Will and said calmly, "Go ahead." Will nodded once. "You asked about accountability," he said slowly. "And the truth is, I've spent the last few years thinking about that word more than any other." The audience sat still, listening. When something happens in front of the entire world, Will continued, you don't just deal with it once. You deal with it every day after. Joy crossed her arms lightly. "But some people say the apology came late," she replied. "That it took time before people heard directly from you." A few quiet murmurs rippled through the audience. Will didn't react defensively. Instead, he nodded. "That's fair." The honesty surprised the panel slightly. Sunny leaned forward. "So what was happening behind the scenes during that time?" she asked. Because from the outside, people only see silence. Will paused. Then he gave a small, tired smile. "Silence doesn't always mean someone isn't thinking," he said. "Sometimes it means they're trying to understand themselves first." Whoopi studied his expression. "And did you?" she asked. Will looked down at his hands. "Some days, yes. And some days." Sarah asked quietly. Will let out a breath. "Some days you realize you're not the person you thought you were." The audience grew even quieter. Joy raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's a big statement." Will nodded. "It is." He looked toward the audience briefly before continuing. "When you grow up in this industry, people tell you a story about yourself. They say you're the positive guy, the funny guy, the guy who always smiles." A few people in the audience nodded instinctively. "That image becomes a kind of armor," Will continued. "And after a while, you start believing that's all you are." Sunny tilted her head. "But something broke that image." Will gave a small laugh. "Yeah, you could say that." The tension in the room remained heavy. Joy tapped her pen against the table. "But the public reaction was intense," she said. "Some people forgave you. Some people didn't." Will looked directly at her. "And that's their right." Joy seemed slightly surprised by the calmness of the answer. "But doesn't that bother you?" she asked. "Of course it does," Will replied immediately. His voice was still steady, but there was a deeper emotion behind it now. "No one enjoys disappointing people," he said. "Especially people who supported you for decades." Whoopi nodded slowly. "That's real." Will continued. "But what hurt the most wasn't the criticism," he admitted. The audience leaned in again. "It was realizing that the moment I lost control, I hurt more than just my reputation." Sunny's voice softened. "You mean your family?" Will swallowed slightly. "Yeah." The room felt heavier again. Sarah spoke carefully. "That must have been incredibly difficult for them too." Will nodded. "My kids had to see their father become a headline for the wrong reason." The audience shifted uncomfortably. "And that's something you can't undo." Joy leaned forward again. "But some people believe the consequences you faced weren't enough," she said. The words landed sharply. Sunny glanced at Joy, slightly surprised by how directly she said it. Will looked at Joy calmly. "What consequences would have been enough?" he asked. The question hung in the air. Joy hesitated for the first time. Well, some viewers feel that public figures should face stronger accountability when they make mistakes on such a massive stage. Will nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting idea. His voice was calm, but now there was a firmness to it. Let me ask you something, he said. Joy lifted her chin slightly. Sure. Will looked around the panel. When someone makes the worst mistake of their life in front of millions of people, what exactly is the right punishment? The audience was completely silent now. Sunny spoke carefully. I don't think people necessarily want punishment, she said. I think they want understanding and growth. Will nodded slowly. That's what I've been trying to do. Joy wasn't convinced yet. But growth usually comes with tough questions, she said. Will gave a faint smile. And you're definitely asking them. A few members of the audience laughed nervously. Whoopi finally leaned forward again. Look, she said, her voice calm but firm. The point of this conversation isn't to trap anybody. It's to understand where someone is now. She turned to Will. So where are you now? Will didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the audience again. Then back at the panel. Honestly, he said. Whoopi nodded. Honestly. Will exhaled slowly. I'm still figuring it out. The vulnerability in that answer caught everyone slightly off guard. Sawa nodded gently. That's a human answer. But Joy still seemed thoughtful. So what have you learned from everything that happened? Will looked at her. The answer came quietly. That being human means sometimes you fail in ways you never imagined. The studio stayed silent. And when that happens, Will continued, you don't get to erase it. Sunny asked softly, so what do you do instead? Will looked down again briefly. Then he raised his eyes. You face it. The tension in the studio was thick now. But Joy asked one more question. And it was the question that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Then let me ask you something honestly. Will, she said. He nodded. Do you think the world has forgiven you, or do you think they are still waiting for something more? The audience turned their attention back to Will, and the expression on his face shifted. Because this time, the emotion wasn't just reflection. It was something deeper, something raw. And when Will spoke again, his voice carried a weight that no one in the studio expected. Will didn't answer Joy's question right away. The studio lights hummed softly overhead, and the cameras stayed locked on his face. For the first time since he walked onto the stage, the confident rhythm of the conversation had completely disappeared. Will rested his elbows lightly on the table and looked down for a moment. Then he looked back up. You want the honest answer, he said quietly. Joy nodded. That's why we're here. Will let out a slow breath. I don't think the world owes me forgiveness. The audience reacted with a soft murmur. It wasn't the answer many people expected. Sunny leaned forward slightly, clearly intrigued by his honesty. What makes you say that? She asked. Will folded his hands together again. Because forgiveness isn't something you can demand, he said. And it's definitely not something you deserve just because time passed. Joy tilted her head. So you think people still have a right to be angry? Will nodded immediately. Absolutely. A few audience members clapped quietly again, surprised by how direct he was being. But the conversation wasn't getting lighter. If anything, it was getting more intense. Sawa spoke carefully. But you've spent a lot of time talking about growth and reflection. At some point, don't you have to move forward? Will gave a faint smile. That's the tricky part. He looked out toward the audience again. Moving forward doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. Whoopi nodded slowly, clearly understanding what he meant. That's true, she said. Joy tapped her pen lightly against the desk again. But the moment you're talking about didn't just affect you, she said. It affected an entire industry, an entire broadcast watched by millions. The tension returned immediately. Will didn't look away from her. I know. Joy continued. And some people feel that moment changed how audiences look at celebrities. Sunny glanced at Joy again, sensing the direction of the conversation. What do you mean? Sunny asked. Joy turned slightly toward her. For years, Joy said, people believed celebrities were polished, controlled, untouchable. She gestured toward Will. But then something happened that reminded everyone that even the biggest stars can lose control. The room was completely silent again. Will nodded slowly. That's true. Sawa spoke gently. But isn't that also what makes people human? Will smiled faintly. It does. Then his expression shifted again. But it also means the world gets to watch your worst moment forever. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sunny asked softly, "Does that still affect you?" Will didn't hesitate. "Every day." That answer hit harder than anything he had said so far. The vulnerability in his voice made the entire studio feel smaller. Joy leaned back slightly. "So you're still carrying that weight?" Will looked at her. "You don't just drop something like that and walk away." Whoopi finally leaned forward again, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Let me ask you something," she said. Will turned toward her. "You've had one of the most successful careers in entertainment," Whoopi continued. "Movies, music, awards, decades of love from fans." She paused. "But do you ever feel like one moment erased all of that?" The audience leaned forward. It was a powerful question. Will sat very still for a second. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah." The honesty shocked the room. Sunny's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You really feel that way?" Will shrugged lightly. "Sometimes." Sarah looked concerned. "But your career still means so much to people." Will smiled gently. "I know, and I'm grateful for that." Then he added quietly, "But when the internet decides your worst moment defines you, it's hard not to see it that way too." Joy crossed her arms again. "But public figures have always been judged harshly." Will nodded. "That's true. But the internet changed the speed of that judgment," he added. The audience murmured softly. "Before," Will continued, "a mistake might live in newspapers for a few days." He gestured slightly. "Now it lives everywhere, forever." Sunny spoke thoughtfully. "That's the reality of modern fame." Will nodded. "And it forces you to confront something about yourself you might never have seen otherwise." Joy looked curious. "What do you mean?" Will leaned back slightly. "I spent most of my life trying to be perfect," he admitted. The audience listened closely. The perfect actor. The perfect husband. The perfect father. The guy who always smiles and makes everyone feel good. Sarah nodded slowly. "That's how people saw you." Will gave a small, almost sad laugh. "Yeah." Then his voice lowered. "But the truth is, no one can live up to that image forever." The weight of that statement hung in the room. Sunny spoke softly. "So when that image cracked, the world saw the real pressure behind it." Will looked at her. "Exactly." Joy leaned forward again, clearly still wrestling with the subject. "But here's the question people still ask," she said. Will waited. "Do you regret that moment?" The room became absolutely silent. Even the audience seemed to hold their breath. Will didn't dodge the question. He didn't look away. Instead, he answered slowly. "Every single day." The sincerity in his voice was impossible to ignore. Sarah nodded gently. "That's a heavy thing to carry." Will gave a small nod. "It is." Whoopi watched him carefully. "But regret alone doesn't change the past," she said. Will agreed. "No, it doesn't." Then Whoopi asked the question that shifted the emotional tone again. "So what have you done since then to make sure you never become that person again?" The audience turned their attention back to Will. He took a deep breath. For a moment, it looked like he might give a simple answer. But instead, something about his expression changed. The calm composure he had maintained throughout the interview suddenly cracked just slightly. Because the answer to that question wasn't simple. And when Will finally spoke again, the emotion in his voice was impossible to hide. "I had to confront parts of myself I didn't even know existed." The audience leaned closer. And what he said next made the entire room feel even more tense. Will's words hung in the air. "I had to confront parts of myself I didn't even know existed." The audience sat silently, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone in the room knows something deeply personal is about to be revealed. Sunny Hostin leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean by that?" she asked gently. Will rested his hands together again, staring at them for a moment before answering. "You spend your whole life building a version of yourself," he said slowly. "The version the world expects. The version your fans love." He looked up. "But sometimes, you build that version so well that you stop paying attention to what's happening underneath it." Joy Behar watched him carefully, her expression softer now than it had been earlier. "And what was happening underneath?" she asked. Will took a breath. "Pressure," he said simply. The audience murmured quietly. "Not just career pressure," he continued. "Family pressure. Personal expectations. Trying to be everything to everyone." Sarah Haynes nodded sympathetically. "That sounds exhausting." Will laughed faintly. "Yeah, it was." Whoopi Goldberg folded her hands together, listening closely. "But pressure alone doesn't usually explode in one moment like that," she said. Will nodded slowly. You're right. He paused, searching for the right words. Pressure builds quietly, he explained. It stacks up in ways you don't even notice until one day, something small pushes it over the edge. Joy tilted her head slightly. So you're saying that moment wasn't really about that moment? Will looked at her. Exactly. Sunny asked carefully. Then what was it about? Will leaned back slightly, the chair creaking softly beneath him. It was about years of trying to be perfect, he said. Years of trying to protect everyone around me. Years of trying to keep everything together. The audience remained completely still. And eventually, he continued, something inside me snapped. The honesty in his voice made the room feel heavier. Sawa spoke softly. Do you feel like you've forgiven yourself? The question seemed to catch Will off guard. He blinked once, thinking about it. That's actually the hardest part, he admitted. Joy raised an eyebrow. Harder than dealing with public criticism. Will nodded. Way harder. The audience reacted with quiet surprise. Public criticism is loud, Will explained. But self-criticism is constant. Sunny nodded slowly, clearly understanding what he meant. And you can't escape it. Will looked at her. Exactly. Whoopi finally leaned forward again, her voice calm but thoughtful. But the reason people are still interested in this story, she said, is because they want to know what happens next. Will listened. Not just what you regret, Whoopi continued, but who you become after something like that. The audience nodded along. Will sat quietly for a moment. Then he answered honestly. I'm still becoming that person. Joy gave a small half smile. That's not a very Hollywood answer. A few people in the audience laughed softly. Will smiled too. Yeah, well, real life isn't very Hollywood. The tension eased slightly. But Joy wasn't finished yet. There's another thing people talk about, she said. Will turned toward her again. The responsibility that comes with influence. Sunny nodded. Millions of people watch what you do. Joy continued. And some of them look up to you. Will nodded slowly. I know. Joy asked the question carefully. So what do you say to someone who saw that moment and felt disappointed in you? The room became quiet again. Will looked out toward the audience. Then back to the panel. I'd say they have every right to feel that way. The sincerity in his answer softened the atmosphere again. But I'd also say this, he continued. He leaned forward slightly. If you never make mistakes, it's easy to look perfect. The audience listened closely. But real growth, Will said, only happens after you fail. Sunny nodded thoughtfully. That's true. Will continued. And if someone watched that moment and learned something about controlling their own anger, then maybe something good came from it. The audience murmured in agreement. Sawa smiled gently. That's a powerful way to look at it. Will shrugged slightly. It's the only way I know how to move forward. Joy looked at him for a moment. Then she said something that surprised everyone. You know, when we started this conversation, I expected you to be defensive. The audience reacted with quiet laughter. Will smiled. I've had enough time to get past that. Joy nodded slowly. But I will say this. She leaned forward slightly. This might be one of the most honest interviews you've ever given. The audience began to clap. Not loudly, but sincerely. Will looked genuinely moved by the reaction. Whoopi glanced out at the audience, then back at Will. You know, she said calmly, people forget that growth is messy. Will nodded. It definitely is. Whoopi smiled slightly. But what matters is whether someone is willing to look at themselves honestly. Will took a breath. That's what I've been trying to do. The applause grew a little louder. For the first time since the interview began, the tension in the room began to shift into something else. Understanding. Reflection. Even a little respect. But just as the conversation seemed ready to calm down completely, Whoopi asked one final question. And it was the one that would send the entire studio into an emotional silence. Will, she said gently, if you could go back to that night, knowing everything you know now, what would you say to the version of yourself standing in that moment? The audience turned toward him again. Will didn't answer immediately. Because this question was different. This question wasn't about headlines or controversy. It was about something much deeper. And when Will finally spoke, his voice carried a raw emotion that no one in the room expected to hear on live television. Will sat completely still after Whoopi asked the question. If you could go back to that night, knowing everything you know now, what would you say to the version of yourself standing in that moment? The studio lights felt brighter somehow. The audience was silent. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered. Even the cameras seemed to pause on Will's face as he looked down at the table in front of him. For the first time during the entire interview, he looked overwhelmed. Not defensive. Not frustrated. Just emotional. Will slowly rubbed his hands together, gathering his thoughts. Then he looked up. His voice was quiet. I'd tell him to breathe. The simplicity of the answer caught everyone off guard. Joy Behar blinked slightly. Just breathe. Will nodded. Yeah. He paused again, choosing his words carefully. Because when you're in a moment like that, everything moves fast. The audience listened closely. Your emotions move faster than your thoughts, Will continued. Your pride moves faster than your judgment. Sunny Hostin nodded slowly. And sometimes, Will said, 1 second of emotion can change years of your life. The room remained completely still. Sarah Haynes spoke softly. So you'd stop yourself. Will nodded again. If I could go back, he said, I'd put my hand on my own shoulder and say, this moment doesn't need your reaction. The honesty in his voice was heavy. Walk away, he added quietly. The audience began clapping gently. Not loudly, but with understanding. Will gave a small smile, though his eyes looked slightly glassy under the bright studio lights. But life doesn't give you that second chance, he continued. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward slightly. No, she said calmly. It usually doesn't. Will nodded. So the only thing you can do after a mistake like that is decide what kind of person you're going to be next. The audience applauded again, a little louder this time. Joy Behar looked thoughtful. Well, she said slowly, I think a lot of people watching today saw a different side of you. Sunny nodded. A very human side. Will gave a humble shrug. That's the only side I've got. The audience laughed softly. The tension that had filled the studio earlier had slowly transformed into something more reflective. Whoopi glanced toward the crowd. You know, she said, one thing about life is that nobody gets through it without messing up. The audience murmured in agreement. The real question, Whoopi continued, is what someone does after the mistake. Will looked at her gratefully. That's the part I'm still working on. Sawa smiled warmly. Well, I think people respect honesty. Joy nodded slightly, especially when it's this raw. The conversation was clearly winding down now, but the emotional weight of the interview still hung in the air. As the cameras slowly widened to show the entire table again, the audience began clapping more confidently. The applause filled the studio. Not the explosive kind celebrities usually receive when they walk out, but the thoughtful kind people give when they feel like they've witnessed something real. Will looked around the room, clearly absorbing the moment. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Whoopi broke the silence. Well, she said with a small smile, this might go down as one of the more honest conversations we've had at this table. The audience laughed softly. Will nodded. Honestly might be all I have left. The room responded with another wave of applause. But what no one inside the studio fully realized yet was how quickly this interview was about to explode online. Because within minutes of the broadcast ending, clips of the emotional exchange began spreading across social media. Viewers everywhere debated what they had just watched. Some praised Will for his vulnerability. Others argued the questions from the hosts had been too harsh. Hashtags began trending. Comment sections filled with thousands of opinions. News outlets replayed the moment again and again. Some called it redemption. Others called it accountability. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. It was unforgettable television. And for viewers watching at home, the conversation raised a question that only they could answer. Did Will Smith truly confront his past? Or was the world still waiting for something more? Now we want to hear from you. What did you think about this emotional moment? Do you believe Will Smith showed real growth during this interview?